Great, thank you very much for having me. I'd like to start off by saying I am part of the infrastructure asset management team within CH2M HILL. So I'm not one of the engineers that were in the design teams at CH2M HILL. As a result, I was able to be completely neutral and unbiased in doing this study, and the stakeholders will tell you that we weren't pushing particular engineering agendas or wanting to build things. It was about understanding what the stakeholders needed, what the problems were, and what the options were for them to move forward with. There was a team of people behind this project, not just myself, not just CH2M HILL, but also the stakeholders as well. This project wouldn't have been possible without their involvement. I was bugging them all the time for information, and they were very good about spending the time and talking about their problems and where things were, so big thanks to all of them. This is what we ended up with, the big final report. So it's a very dense, heavy report, lots of information in there. And I've been asked to summarize it in 25 minutes, so we'll see where we go. There we go. So I'll take you through a brief background in terms of why the study was undergone, what the objectives were of the study. I'll take you through a very quick executive summary, 2 slides. Those are the only 2 slides that you need to really have in your head. The rest of it is all the behind stuff. We'll go into wastewater in a bit more detail, water as well, and there'll be some time for questions at the end. So in terms of the background of the study, growth in Saskatchewan, as you're all talking about, is at an all-time high. This is putting a big pressure on your infrastructure base, whether it's your utilities, your roads. You have this rapid growth happening, which is putting increasing demands on your infrastructure, and your infrastructure getting to that stage where it's old, it's starting to creak, and that's causing some big challenges for you guys. The cost of living and the cost of business is rising. Yourself personally in terms of your houses and your costs, but also yourselves as a municipality. There are various challenges that you're faced with in terms of running your municipality, and you need to be able to make the right decisions that can deliver the most effective solutions at the best cost in maintaining your service. So is there a regional way to do this? This is basically the premise of this project. What's the best way forward? Let's get together and talk about it and work out what the problems are and where we can go forwards. And potentially there is an opportunity for a regional solution that can provide a better or the same service at a lower cost. So the objectives of the study, first objective, we wanted to identify the opportunities for potential collaborations across the region. And you'll see by the map the area that I'm talking about. Second objective was about building bridges and repairing relationships. So that was really important for the study, and was getting people talking about this in a very holistic way across the region. And third one, which is important, is focusing on engineering. So we deliberately avoided the political discussions, the governance discussions about how could this work, in practice as a regional board. We avoided that, and we were looking at, from an engineering perspective, what's actually possible and what is financially viable. So that's what we were looking at. This is the study area. So out to the west, we went as far out as Belle Plaine, east Balgony and the village of Edenwald. And then up in the north, Lumsden and Craven was included as well. Sakamay First Nations was also part of this study, and they were in the workshops involved, moving everything forward. So, the summary, these are the 2 slides. This is the first slide. There's high growth projections for most of the stakeholders in the region. And there's some very strong plans for growth in terms of what's happening, and that's why things like this summit are happening, to try and address those. Strong relationships were built through this study. There was a lot of trust and openness that improved. People were coming to the table with their problems. At the start, it was a challenge in terms of getting people to open up and put their cards on the table in terms of where they're at with their water and the wastewater systems. But by the end of it, it was a very open environment, and we were having some real productive discussions in terms of what things are happening. It's important to note here that there are already a number of regional relationships already happening. This isn't the start of it. Buffalo Pound Water Treatment Plant is a good example. Pilot Butte and Balgony already have a water line that they're sharing water through. Bruce mentioned the White City and the RM of Edenwald Wastewater Treatment Authority that's going on, and they're helping each other there already. So this is already happening. This study was basically a way of giving a wider view across the region rather than just peer-to-peer. Is there a bigger regional solution that we can look to? So water. In the short term, there's no major water problems. There's going to be a challenge as things start to grow, but in the immediate term, it's not the big headache. Water infrastructure is generally in fair to good status in the region. Buffalo Pound provides a good, reliable source of water, and there's an abundant raw water supply there. Growth in the existing east communities is going to start to constrain the Xena aquifer. So at the moment, it's all groundwater that's coming through, and those communities are going to start to be faced with challenges using that aquifer as the growth starts to get higher. You'll notice here that we're talking about raw water. This is about the water that's actually in the system. It's not the size of your treatment plant, because obviously you could build as big a treatment plant as you want, but if you don't have the right water going into it and the right amount of water, you can only produce so much clean drinking water. So things that we looked at from a regional perspective was an east regional pipeline or a regional water system. So we'll talk about that a bit later. And water conservation is potentially something that could be done to extend the deadline. So you'll see later on the timelines that we're talking about here. So water conservation will allow that deadline to be extended whilst also producing the benefit of easing pressures in the wastewater system, which you'll see when I go into next is the main problem. So challenges with wastewater exists now. Wastewater infrastructure in the region is generally in fair to poor status, and we see this across Canada. Water is easy to invest in terms of selling to the council, selling to the citizens. Everyone needs clean drinking water, so it's easier to sell. People forget about what happens when they flush the toilet, but now's the time where we can't really forget about it anymore, and this is where it's becoming a bit of a challenge for the region. There's immediate capacity issues for many of the stakeholders, and I'll explain that in a little bit more detail. And affected municipalities that are in this critical zone that we were talking about, they're already pursuing local solutions as they have to. So this is something that we're going to discuss today. From a wastewater perspective, there are real options, real viable options from an engineering perspective that should be talked about. First one being a north wastewater pipeline from the city of Regina's existing wastewater treatment plant up to the town of Lumsden. That's a real option. The other real option that was highlighted earlier on was an east solution. So a pipeline out to the east and some sort of potentially a treatment facility there, or using the Regina's existing facility. We can talk about that in a bit more detail. We also looked at a pipeline out to the west, but as you'll see, a full pipeline out to the west isn't really the best option. There is potentially a connection with Grand Coulee and the Global Transportation Hub, so we'll talk about that as well. The biggest thing about wastewater, timing is critical. For a lot of these stakeholders, decisions need to be made very soon. It's already starting to impact growth and development, and we need to take action. And hopefully these 2 days at this summit, we're going to be able to make progress and put in action plans in place to develop this. So wastewater in a little bit more detail. In the West, when we started this project, the stakeholders came to us with their growth projections and their population projections, but given the course of the project and as we were talking about some of the infrastructure challenges, population forecasts and projections were changed. So the West was one example where we started to talk about the infrastructure that would be required to support bigger communities, and population caps and forecasts were changed slightly, which basically meant that a full regional solution, there wasn't the population body to support it. You could obviously build a pipeline, but it's going to be very expensive, and local options were better value for money for them. The exception there being, because of Grand Coulee's very close proximity to the GTH, there could be a connection in there to the system. So that was something that was looked at in the West. In the North, Craven, there's no immediate concerns for wastewater. Things are in good shape, and they have capacity for the growth that they want to do. Lumsden, there is current problems right now, a lack of treatment capacity. They're looking at a local facility. They've done some existing pre-design work on that, but they're also in discussions with Regina about this regional pipeline that could go in place. The east. This is where it gets a bit more challenging. There are capacity concerns with all the stakeholders in the east, including the city of Regina. Local options would include a local wastewater treatment plant for White City and Emerald Park. Local lagoon upgrades would need to be put in place at Balgony and Pilot Butte to handle their growth. And there'd be a number of city conveyance upgrades that need to get done. There's a lot of city growth happening in the southeast of the city, so there needs to be some conveyance upgrades to manage that. So that's the local options. Regionally, what we looked at was a regional pipeline, and I've got a slide that explains that in a bit more detail. Key points about both of these regional solutions: it needs everybody on board. If some of the stakeholders aren't bought into this, it's not going to work. It's not going to be viable as an option. It needs everyone in it together, otherwise it's going to be more cost prohibitive. With the pipeline, you can add the wastewater treatment plant, a regional wastewater treatment plant in the future if it's required. You know, if growth doesn't go the way you think it's going, the East Regional Treatment Plant wouldn't necessarily need to happen, but if growth is going to happen, then you do need something out in the east that can process the wastewater. We looked at the wastewater treatment plant. Again, everyone needs to be on board. Could be led by a regional board, and as was highlighted by the White Butte group, they were already in discussions about a regional wastewater authority to manage that. So, you know, it's not saying that the regional treatment plant would be operated by any one of the stakeholders. It can be done collectively, like as is done in Buffalo Pound, or there's a number of other regional models that could be employed. And also the pipeline wouldn't solve the Regina's challenges in the southeast, so it's to be looking for an East Regional Treatment Plant would ease the city conveyance challenges. So, City of Regina in a little bit more detail. There's currently servicing issues for the city, which is exacerbated by the growth projections, and that's particularly in the southeast where a lot of the growth is happening. The city is going to need to do something significant to address these issues, and that's what part of this is about, is understanding what the options are. For the city, there's three major options that they can look at. First one is conveyance upgrades through the city, upgrading the pipes that are already in place to get it from the southeast up into the existing treatment plant in the west. The other option would be construct a big bypass, just big pipe all the way around. That's another option to look at. Or the other one would be looking to buy into an East Regional Treatment Plant. So instead of shipping all the waste from the southeast up to the west, could we just treat it in the east? That is it, massively oversimplified. It's extremely complicated when you get into it, and further analysis is needed. But that's the crux of it right there. So, into some more of the engineering, which might excite some of you, I might bore some of the rest of you. This is an example of the level of detail that we went into in the project. So when I talk about these options that we looked at in terms of the north pipeline up to Lumsden or the Grand Coulee connection, this is the level of detail that we did. So we mapped out where the pipeline would likely go, very high level. You can see here, where all the communities are. The different colors highlight the different sizes of pipes. So we actually calculated what size of pipe you would need based on your projections. With a keen eye, you can see that there's actually two pipelines going into the city, the purple one and the green one. If you're interested in why that is, you can ask a question and I'll answer it. It's getting very geeky at that point. Or you can catch me at the end over a beer and I can explain it to you. You'll see in the graph in the bottom left, that is the land height. So all the way in the left at the top, you have Balgony. It's downhill from Balgony to the city of Regina. Now, from a pipeline perspective and a conveyance perspective, that is great news. It's easier to design. You can use gravity to help things flow. You don't have to spend a lot of money on pumping. Operations costs are lower. It's a good state of play from an engineering perspective. Something you'll notice there, maintaining existing lagoons, at least in the short term. In the longer term, you could potentially look at, once a regional treatment plant would be put in place, if that was the way that it would go, the communities could potentially release their lagoon land and then use that for development in the longer term. But in the short term, we'd need to keep those lagoons so they could manage the peak loads. Wastewater is all about peak loads in the system. And as I mentioned, there's an opportunity to add a regional treatment plant later. You know, we could look at this pipeline right now, get that in place, and depending how things go in the region, the wastewater treatment plant could be added later on. Next slide is getting into some of the costs. So in addition to the engineering design in terms of what the systems could look like, we costed it up. We went and found appropriate costs in terms of what it could look like, and this is useful for your budgeting and for your planning discussions that will be happening this week. This example here is the combined east solution, so both an east wastewater pipeline and an east regional wastewater treatment plant, and this is how the costs divvy up across the region. From a population point of view, Regina would contribute almost half the population flow to the treatment plant. But you can see there their sliver of the pie isn't half because the pipeline they're not using the pipeline, so the pipeline is a regional cost. As I said, the wastewater treatment plant can be built in the longer term. So you'll see some of these numbers here. They look like big numbers, but bearing in mind this is the cost of both a pipeline and a treatment plant. So in the short term, you're looking at just the pipeline cost. And in the longer term, you're looking at the wastewater treatment plant cost. And in that longer term, that gives you time to work out the funding mechanisms. And as was talked by Metro Vancouver, collectively, you have a lot more power to go and get some of that funding for a bigger regional project, whether it's from the province, the feds. There's money out there for innovative, collaborative approaches like this. From a capital perspective, the numbers are in the right ballpark when you're comparing it to a local option. So when you look at the shares of each of the communities in terms of the local options that they're looking at, the capital options are higher, slightly higher from a cost perspective. But when you look at the operations and maintenance costs, they're significantly lower. So the pre-design work that's been done by a lot of the communities already in terms of what their local solutions could look like, their O&M costs are very high. A regional solution reduces the operating costs substantially, and a lot of these provincial and federal grants help out with the capital costs. So yes, although the capital number seems high, there's a lot more chance of getting some solid funding for this. So looking at the operations cost, it's much lower. And something that was flagged up by a lot of the stakeholders was staffing. When you're talking about these advanced wastewater treatment plants that need to be in place now, staffing is very difficult. You need certified, trained operators. Having this regional solution would minimize the need for having 6 skilled regional operators down to 1 or 2 for that particular regional plant. So to summarize, wastewater in the region, north and east have got immediate challenges. There's existing infrastructure that's reaching its hydraulic capacities. Development's currently on hold for a lot of the stakeholders, and it's really having an impact on your communities right now. There's high growth projections, and that's going to need some big infrastructure. We went through numerous options. That report is available publicly. It's on the Regina website, and it'll be on the Summit website as well. So you can look through that in some more detail. But basically, we need to decide on a north and an east region, are we doing this locally, or are we doing this together? So that's something that needs to be discussed this week. In the west, as I said, there's going to be challenges in the coming years. Small population bodies mean a full global pipeline isn't necessarily viable, but there's a connection with the GTH to be considered. Given the projected growth, we were looking at longer term solutions. With wastewater, it's very difficult to do a kind of small band-aid. We just looked at what is the end solution and then looked at interim solutions that might be required to take people over. And temporary package treatment plants like the one that White City are looking at for a 10-year period, that was discussed as well. So from wastewater onto water. Can you see if you can sort out the colors in that a bit better? Excellent. Okay, so as I said at the start, water, the challenges are around raw water in terms of the allocations from the aquifers or the regional systems. Where are some of the challenges? So this is an example of the level of detail we've got from the water perspective. So you can see the current allocation limits that they're dealing with, their average daily demands, what growth scenario they're using, and where they start to get into trouble in terms of an allocation perspective. This is explained more in the report. All the stakeholders have been part of these discussions. They understand exactly what's behind this and what the messages are coming out of this, and it will be a bit clearer in the next couple of slides. West and north, in terms of a water summary. In the west, the water's coming from Buffalo Pounds. There's the regional pipeline that comes through from the treatment plant, and there's connection lines off those pipelines. As I said at the start, Buffalo Pound provides a reliable water source, and there's an ample raw water supply. In the north, Craven's water allocation is sufficient for their growth projections well into the future. And Lumsden have done a lot of work to manage their aquifer. Lumsden are on a different aquifer to the east, so they've done a lot of work in terms of what's there and what's stable to support their growth. This is the state of play in the east. So this is based on the high growth scenarios that we gathered from the stakeholders, and you can see it going up pretty rapidly from now until 2040. When you overlay the allocations from the aquifer in general, this is what it looks like. So the allocated water in the system is around at that 8,000 mark. So you can see collectively, and not looking individually, but collectively the region in the east, we start to get into problems around 2030 with the allocations of the water. Now, I'll say that aquifer limits are very hard to manage and to predict. You don't know how the aquifer is going to react until you start pulling water out of it. But for the purposes of your planning discussions, this is the state of play as it's understood right now by the Water Security Agency. There's more work scheduled to be done in this in terms of more testing, but this is where it looks like. That top line needs to be separated from the actual allocated water. There needs to be a safety margin in the system, and that's just part of the good practice that needs to be underway. So 2030 is when it starts to become a problem in the east. So a quick summary of the east. There's high growth scenarios as before. The Xeno aquifer, as you saw in that previous graph, has been allocated to the existing users. So that doesn't include the new communities that would be developed in the RM of Sherwood or the RM of Edenwald. That's going to present another challenge for the aquifer base. Based on the current projections of those current communities, we're going to be hitting the aquifer limits around 2030. The RM of Edenwald, with their growth, their particular limits are going to be hit sooner, but that's something that can be done with in terms of managing those allocations and talking with the Water Security Agency. There's going to be moderate infrastructure upgrades required for the local infrastructure in the next 10 to 20 years. So could we look at a regional solution and time that regional solution so that those local upgrades wouldn't necessarily be required, or they could be minimized to save money for the municipalities? And as I said at the start, water conservation could buy time. It can extend that limit in terms of how much water we need, and 2030 could move to 2035, 2040, and it also eases pressure in the wastewater. It's worth saying that although you've got some time with the water, it's now's the time to be thinking about it. We can focus on wastewater for the next couple of years, get a plan in place for that, but don't forget about the water. That will need to be dealt with as well. What we looked at in the east was a water main as before, so you can see it pipelined out. And what we looked at also was a water grid. So a lot of the communities in the east have already spent a lot of money upgrading their existing infrastructure. So Pilot Butte, White City, there's a lot of money being put in place in the last 10, 20 years. So that money shouldn't be wasted. We could look at a water grid where the water can be supplemented from the city of Regina and Buffalo Pounds, and then also they can still maintain their existing sources and form some sort of regional grid there. So last slide, conclusions. The study's been a good step forward in fostering productive, collaborative relationships across the region. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. This really is just phase one. There's a lot of information in there, and it's kind of set some good options and some good directions for going forward. But there really is a lot more work that needs done, and from a wastewater perspective, needs done pretty quickly. Timing is critical, and decisions are going to need to be made very soon. Otherwise, people are going to be forced into choosing decisions regardless of other options. In terms of what you need to look at doing, you should be thinking about allocating money for phase two within your budgets. And I know that's something that's going to come up in the discussions either this afternoon or tomorrow, and developing your action plans. And that's really what this study's about in terms of the summit and how you're going to move forward. So that's it. Thank you very much.